Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the latest installment in the Crossroads series. I'll be your host for today. My name is Benjamin Calver, and I am a PhD student and research scientist here at CrossLabs. For those of you who are new to the format, the Crossroads series is run here at CrossLabs, a research institute in lovely Kyoto. We're supported by CrossCompass, one of the leading AI companies in all of Japan. The overall goal of CrossLabs is to really understand the mind, intelligence, and evolution through computational as well as theoretical research. And here at the lab, we explore ideas ranging from brain science, artificial intelligence, information sciences, artificial life, changes in society, open-endedness, and pretty much everything in between. Every month here at Crossroads, we talk about intelligence and really what parts of the sciences help us understand a bit more about what they are, how they're part of the world, and really aiming towards how we might recreate intelligent and biological systems from scratch. The cross in Crossroads actually refers to the bridge between many different disciplines in artificial intelligence, as well as artificial life, as well as industry and academia, really because I think we know it takes a lot of different perspectives to tackle these big questions. And what this is here, this is our monthly forum where we invite cool and exciting speakers from a wide variety of backgrounds to share their research, just so we can have an exciting discussion about their topics. As always today, it will happen in two parts. First, we will have the guest speaker, and that will be followed by a Q&A session from the live audience. For the Q&A, we have a Slido link that people can use to ask questions, or you can just ask them in the YouTube chat. And now, without further ado, I am happy to introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker today is Dr. Pavel Chvykov. Dr. Chvykov graduated from MIT with a doctorate in physics under Jeremy England, with his subject being the theoretical foundations behind the origins of life. He then worked at General Motors, building effective and coordinated AI systems. And now he finds himself as an independent researcher working for the Institute for Globally Distributed Open Research and Education, focusing on complexity science, engineering, economics, cognitive sciences, as well as contemplative studies. And today he's here to talk about something that is very close to our hearts here at CrossLabs, Telics, the science of goals. So please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Chvykov. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah, or just dropped for a second. So, all right. So what I'll talk about is kind of a new framing on a lot of my research that I'm really excited about lately. It's in collaboration with Matthew Barbier at INCP in France, which is an institute in the Pyrenees in France. And it's basically the reason I like it is because it's a perspective that seems to kind of frame and put together a lot of the research threads that I've thought about. But it's also fairly new, so the presentation will not be like, this is the conclusion of how we should do science or solve problems. But instead, it's kind of a perspective that is a little bit in progress with some specific concrete examples and projects that have been completed that I'm now trying to frame in this new way. So, okay, so are my slides up? Should I go on? Yeah.
Nope.
Sorry. Yeah, I think it might have been my thing.
Minor technical difficulties.
So I'll just keep talking for a bit in the process. I have a lot to get through, so this is always a good opportunity to have a bit extra. So the main perspective is that this is kind of a different perspective on how to think about science, right? So usually we think of science as kind of materialist, Enlightenment perspective that came up a few hundred years ago, where we think of the world as made of matter, which is made of atoms, and everything that exists comes up as combinations of these little particles that emerge into some wholes. Now, that's one perspective, right? And lately, and in general, I think it's realized that that's a perspective that's not necessarily like the fundamental truth, right? And there are many alternative perspectives. Now, the question about which perspective is good or not is a question of which perspective is useful for science, right? So this materialist perspective has been extraordinarily useful for the scientific and industrial revolution to make the devices and the world that we are now familiar with. But yeah. Yes, let's do that. That's easy enough. Sorry, 1 second. And here, here. How's that? Great. Yeah. So good. So I can keep going with the slides. Great. Yeah. So here I'll be kind of talking about, okay, can we think of science and the world in a different way? And could that actually be more useful for some of the questions that science has been stuck with for a while, such as origins of life? Okay, so the journey is going to be, I'll frame what the problem and the challenge of the question of origins of life is. Then present this kind of metaphysical perspective. I hate to do this, but we have to start with some metaphysical agreement and background on science is not about finding the truth, capital T, but it's about building useful models. From that, I'll talk about two categories of models, mechanistic versus agentic or telic, which is goal-directed. And the first, mechanistic, being kind of physics, like everything is made of atoms that are just bouncing around. Then we'll go a little bit again into origins of life and like my perspective and hypothesis on the question of origins of life is that it's, life originates when the agentic perspective becomes more useful or better than the mechanistic. Right? So if some system is better described by goals than by other, then we should think of that life, or life has originated. Then we'll talk about kind of Telics and this perspective of agentic model building more broadly and what it could mean kind of in general and how it compares to physics. And then I'll go into some specific to example where we can maybe see some hints of, these two perspectives and how they relate to each other. I'll talk about Rattling, which is a theoretical framework that I developed during my PhD, and that kind of is could be seen as a theory of abiotic adaptation, basically how non-biological entities can exhibit properties like adaptation or adaptability, which then gives them some qualities that are perhaps better described as agents than as particles, right? And then we'll kind of give a little bit of outlook on more complex questions that Telics perspective can talk about, such as nested agents, where you have cells inside an organ, inside an organism, inside a society, inside a global infrastructure, and talk about problems of coordination and additional. So it's touching on a lot of different topics, really trying to kind of cover broad ground. And I'm not going to have many conclusions of like this is the result. So, bear with me. We'll try to have enough signposts so that we don't get lost. And it's very much a work in progress. So I'm very excited for collaborations or thoughts or feedback that you might have. Yeah. Okay, so origins of life. The way that I like to phrase that question is, how does non-living matter turn into living matter? If we start on Earth that is not alive, how does it become alive? And the problem with that question is that what is living? If you have that formulation, then how do you know if something is living? If I have a bunch of proteins and molecules and they're all bouncing into each other, how do I know that now this little agglomerate that has some metabolism, that has some boundaries, right? How do I, when is the line that I can start calling it alive, right, or living? Go to Wikipedia, ask what living means, and it tells you this, for example, right? Biology says that things that are alive are ones that grow, reproduce, have heredity, homeostasis, metabolism, cellular, made out of cells, and respond to their environment. But of course, right, if the problem with any definition like that is I can start poking holes in it, and then I can poke a lot of holes in it, right? So if we go to another planet and we discover a race of sentient robots, right? They may not be made of cells. They may not have the same sort of metabolism, right? Maybe they don't reproduce, but instead they just fix themselves and have kind of eternal lives, right? Would we not call these robots alive just because they don't fit these few criteria, right? It seems like what we mean by alive is really not hinged on these specific criteria, but it's something a lot more about agency, about being able to interact with your environment in smart ways and communicate and some other aspect. So, we can imagine coming up with some other fancy definition for this, as I just was kind of um, sketching. But, any definition you come up with, you can also poke holes in it, probably, right? So maybe it's just something that you have to do, okay, you know it when you see it, right? And that's a little bit, non-committal and a little bit hard to work with, but it could also be a useful direction and perspective. And I'll actually get into that. I have one project specifically entertaining that possibility. Okay, so this is the metaphysical bit that if you don't agree with, the beauty of metaphysics is that I can't really convince you of it. So if you don't agree with it, then just suspend disbelief for the moment, because we'll need to have some common metaphysical ground to base everything else on. So yeah, the proposal that I want to put forth is that science is about building useful models, not about finding the true nature of reality, right? So everything that we ever know is a model or even a metaphor, which I'll get into a little bit more why that is in the next slide. So the thing in itself is unknowable, as Kant put it, in the sense that, right, if I look at the world out there, right, so maybe you've seen this joke, is that how a normal person sees the world on the top and how a scientist sees the world on the bottom. So if I look at the world out there, I don't see the thing in itself, right? If I look at a tree, for example, right, I see my idea of what a tree is. I don't see the thing, right? And it's always mediated by my sense organs, by my eyes, by my ears, by my touch, uh, which are imperfect, right? So I don't see the full spectrum of light. I only see the narrow visible spectrum. So all of that will create certain models in my brain of reality, which I interact with. I don't interact with the actual thing. And scientific models are just another way of putting models using mathematics, right? So in some way, it's kind of similar to how our brain constructs reality out of sense inputs. And then, with some more inference, our brain then constructs these fancy models, right? Neither those models nor what we observe with our senses is the capital T truth. So one way to put it is all models are wrong, but some are useful. And to me, that's kind of the core quote that needs to go behind all of science, right? And I think people don't appreciate it as much as they should. And another beautiful quote I found, actually, as I was hiking in the Himalayas, there was some wooden board with some like washed out writing on it that said the world is not made of atoms, but of tiny stories. And I found that so deep and so profound, because we take it for granted so deeply that no, but like the world really is made of atoms, right? That's not just a story. That's not just a model. It's literally made of atoms. And to just be reminded that it's like, no, that even that is also just a useful model that has been helpful in predicting outcomes of certain experiments. But that's just the story we tell ourselves, just as well as the story that I, as a being, as a Pavel, exist, right? That's also a story. And just having a little bit of humility around this. So speaking of atoms, let's go a little bit more into why metaphors are interesting, and why, in fact, everything we ever do with science and are metaphors. So basically, in the slide, I'll just try to go a little more into justifying the previous slide, that science is about model building. But as I said, I'm not going to be able to prove that, because this is a bit of a metaphysical stance. So this is in collaboration. This project is in collaboration with Xiaowen at Princeton, and basically the starting point for this project is that science evolves through metaphor, right? So for model of an atom, we used to have the idea that atoms are just little marbles. Then we thought that they're like pudding with, electrons embedded in a kind of pudding of positive charge. Then there was the nuclear model from Rutherford, the planetary model from Bohr, and now we have, electron clouds, right? And often we might think that, oh yeah, these previous ones are kind of these like shaky metaphors, okay? But, the electron clouds, that's not a metaphor. That's how the atoms really are, right? And, kind of looking at this perspective, you can be a little bit maybe skeptical of that confidence that we tend to have, because we're so used to this lost model, we take it for granted. And right, like the word clouds itself kind of gives away that it's a metaphor, right? All of these are metaphors for embodied physical experiences that we have in the normal, world, kind of, right? These are all kind of things that are simple to us, that exist on our scale, that are familiar, right? Because to understand abstract concepts, we need to ground it in something we are familiar with in our experience. So, and yeah, everything that we ever do understand, think about, model goes through such metaphors, right? So even language itself, right, is one phrase I really like. It's a reef of dead metaphor. So, for example, words like concrete, like the material, the building material, concrete, that was actually originally, the word was used as physical examples of abstract concepts, right? So conceptual, we can say like a concrete idea. That was the original use of the word concrete. And then when people saw this really concrete material, they thought, oh, that's a very concrete version of idea of a concrete material. Normal, like social norms, that came from carpenter's square, which was made to, make furniture with right angles. And so if you had like a normal table, that would be a table that has good squares. And then eventually it became, social norms, the normal behavior, right? Gravity, the physical force, came originally, the original use was the weight of the situation, the seriousness of the situation, the gravity of the situation, right? And the force that we now think is like the more fundamental, that was actually a metaphor for some conceptual thing. Sloth, the animal, was a metaphor for being lazy, right? Engine in a car was a metaphor for ingenuity or creativity, which was the original use. So a lot of the concepts we take for granted as like, this is the actual thing, are originally metaphors. And similar, a lot of models, including mathematical models, can be thought of as metaphors, as in you're carrying over some structure using some other structure, such as mathematical structure carrying over real physical world structure. And mathematics allows us to go beyond intuition as a kind of formal system of metaphor. So in this project, which I won't get into too much, we're kind of thinking, okay, can we develop a science like metaphorics that can formalize metaphoric reasoning and allow us to go beyond intuition in contexts where mathematics does not work, right? So yeah, so again, this is a work in progress. So and I won't go more into it. If you are curious, you can ask at the end. But this is just to illustrate that, again, the world is not made of atoms, but of tiny stories. And one story that I want to focus on here is this metaphor of mechanistic models versus agentic models. And again, those are just two metaphors, therefore two perspectives on seeing the world, neither of which is true. But let's compare. So, for example, an agentic model might be that a rabbit wants a carrot, right? And the mechanistic model in that same situation would be that photons from the carrot impact the rabbit's retina, triggering neural signals that cause a cascade through the brain, affecting the motor cortex, which makes the rabbit move towards the carrot, right? And those are both equally valid models of reality that give the same, perhaps, conclusion about what you observe. But somehow you can tell that one is more useful than the other, right? You can control the rabbit's behavior and make predictions a lot better with the agentic model than with the mechanistic one, partly because it's a lot simpler. Another case where a ball wants to roll downhill, which is how Aristotelian physics viewed the world for about 2,000 years until Newton came around. And the alternative model is the balance of gravity and normal force result in acceleration, right? And here, the mechanistic formulation is more useful because it allows making more detailed, more nuanced predictions that are more quantitative about where the ball will go, with what speed, acceleration, things like that, right? So again, it's not that mechanistic perspective is always better, agentic is always better. It's that you have these two, and you need to think about which one is more appropriate in which context. These kind of loosely map to materialism versus idealism, matter first versus mind first. And the question is, how do we know which is better, right? So if, for example, for origins of life, if we hypothesis that life originates when this clump of atoms becomes better described as an agent than as a clump of atoms, right? Then that could be a useful perspective on origins of life questions. So we need some specific criteria to know when the agentic model is better than the mechanistic one, or vice versa, right? Okay, are we good? Is this too much? I don't know if we want to take questions in the middle, probably maybe leave it to the end, but good. Okay, then let's just take a little pause so that we're not going too crazy. I'll have some structured pauses in the presentation, but and just to breathe and integrate. Mindfulness is a big thing of what I'm practicing these days and teaching, so I want to incorporate that. Yeah. That's why I wanted to give this talk. Yeah. Hopefully Yeah. No, it's nice. I also tend to speak quite fast. So. Okay, so I want to go back to this "you know it when you see it" perspective on life. And this is, when is the agentic model better? Well, you know it when you see it. So this is a project we're doing with Sander at Antwerp Social Labs, who is a psychologist. And so here, this "you know it when you see it" can actually be formalized as a concrete question if we are in the psychology department, right? You basically just need to ask, okay, so how do people intuitively distinguish agents versus objects, right? And then do psychology or cognitive science experiments where you show people things and you ask them, does this look like an agent or an object to you? We notice that there's a bit of a survival adaptation that we have that makes it kind of a telic bias, that our kind of first a priori assumption is that it's probably an agent, just because that's safer, right? That unless we're really sure that this rock isn't sentient and won't run after us and kill us, we would rather think of it as an agent that wants to roll down hills, right? Because that gives us kind of more survivability. So it's a little bit like negativity bias that here manifests as kind of Telics bias, which is why a lot of the early scientific models were agentic based, and the mechanistic ones are also kind of more recent. So these are the things that Sander and I are showing to participants. So these sorts of movies with this little black dot in the upper right corner moving around, and we're saying based on the motion itself, which do you think, or not which, but do you think, how agentic does it look? Like which of these three looks most like an agent? So I'll play these one after another. So the left one, then the middle one, and yeah, see how alive this looks to you, right? And then the one on the right. So between these three, which one seemed most alive? I don't know if we want to answer that question too.
I suppose me personally, the third one felt the most alive.
Yeah, this is what we're struggling with. So, so the idea was that we were going for the middle one being more alive, but this was something that when we ran the experiment, we did have this kind of issue. So that the ones on the right tended to be more alive. So we're kind of going back to controlling for things. But the overall idea is that goals is the core thing that makes something look agentic. And the viewer needs to infer whether the thing looks like it has goals, right? And basically our hypothesis here is that in order to see that something has a goal, it needs to make mistakes. So the one on the left is kind of achieves its goal perfectly of going to the blue, right? And therefore it doesn't look alive because it just looks like a mechanistic motion, right? The one in the middle makes some mistakes, but also gets to the goal, which supposedly kind of seeing something go to a goal and then make mistakes and then correct and keep going to the goal is kind of a reinforcing loop that creates this perception that, oh yeah, there are goals and there are mistakes, right? If you have only goals, it looks mechanistic. If you have only mistakes, as the one on the right, then it can look random. The reason why the one on the right sometimes doesn't look random and looks alive is because first of all, a lot of random motion looks alive to humans, and second of all, just because there's more motion, and we have a bias that the more something moves, the more it's probably alive. So, yeah, so that's also a work in progress. But still, this idea of you know it when you see it, and you can have a model of human perception of agency. Again, we were talking about how to quantitatively determine whether something is more mechanistic or more agentic. The other way is using information theory. And this is a more technical project that I won't go into details about. It was in collaboration with Eric Howell at Tufts. But basically, Eric has this definition of effective information, which is an information theoretic quantity that for a given causal model will give you a specific number, and the higher that number is, the more effective, causally effective that model is. So here you could specifically, for a given phenomena, look at agentic or mechanistic model and just compare this effective information metric for the two models. The issue is it's a little complicated to calculate in practice, but that's work that Eric has been doing for a while, and they have a lot of tools for this now. But basically, roughly, this metric, effective information, captures how the various possible causal interventions map to different effects that the model has, or how different a given intervention is from all other interventions. So yeah, again, if you're interested, I can go back to it at the end. But for now, our specific work with him was called Causal Geometry, this paper at the top. And yeah, it's quite interesting kind of geometric formulation of matching metrics of two different spaces. And this was the planned pause. So, yeah, so let's take a breath. Try to make sense of what has been said for a moment.
Yeah, somebody said the middle one, Wolfgang Lucas said that the middle one incidentally seemed more alive, and then Martin also said that the right one seems more alive. So there is obviously this dilemma between if what we're inferring is what the goal is, and and maybe being too alive makes us biased to what we think is alive in a way. So do you think there's some sort of threshold where something is
too alive so that it doesn't
too alive? Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess
it must be. Yeah,
I guess you can think of if you think of like what is it, the luck potion in Harry Potter, right? Where he takes this potion that makes him just brilliantly lucky, and then he starts doing actions that make no sense to anybody around him, but that end up being perfectly correct. But right, from an outsider's perspective, some super intelligence might be doing actions that seem random or nonsensical, right? But then, they end up being somehow perfectly the right actions in retrospect, right? But in the moment, they might be too computationally complex for us to understand as meaningful.
It's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah. Okay, so this is where we are in the outline. So we talked about the origins of life setup. We talked about the models of two types, mechanistic versus agentic. And we talked about how to understand origins of life, we need to see a scenario where the agentic model becomes more effective than the mechanistic one. So next we'll go a little bit into this kind of broader perspective of what do we mean by Telics, right? That if we had a science that is centered around agentic model building rather than mechanistic model building, right? What would that look like, right? In some sense, that's, animism, going back to, the tree has a spirit, the lightning has a spirit, and all of that. But, now that we are scientists and we have all this background behind us, could we actually make animism into something that allows us to predict and control? And, is there something to salvage from that perspective? And then we'll go into, because I talked about just identifying when something is more alive and not, but, origins of life question is why should that emerge, right, in the first place in a non-biological system? And so we'll go into some toy examples and a theoretical framework, Rattling, which kind of suggests why that might happen. So Telics, science of goals. And this is a lot of these ideas are from Matthew, who we're working with now. Basically, he's been thinking about this for many years, and I just this year read some of his writing and got really excited about it, and we started having conversations. But yeah, it's quite abstract, so it's a little bit difficult to figure out how to formalize and turn into something very concrete. So we're these are some of the first kind of steps. So the idea is that science currently is dominated by mechanistic models, and they're considered more true. Usually people think of it as like capital T true, that like, no, the world really is made of atoms, right? Some of the problems with that perspective is that some scientific questions end up being very complicated if you have a mechanistic paradigm. Questions of origins of life, as I brought up, questions of free will, and questions of subjective experience, like qualia, and a bunch of other ones. But one might argue it's like, well, these are problems that they're complicated, but we're making progress on them, and some of them, maybe we will solve. And yes, for sure. But the fact that these problems have been so difficult for so long is already indicating that somehow within mechanistic paradigms these questions are not easy, even though in our personal kind of lived experience they are some of the most common normal things we interact with. And the problems might be just impractical, that if you're trying to simulate a mind or society from atoms or proteins, that's just going to be computationally impossible. And it's like, in principle it's feasible, but in practice it's just not the way you want to model things, right? And that's a kind of reasonable, legit point to consider. And the second is that it could be misleading, such as with origins of life. As I said, that like it's hard to ask the question of origins of life if you don't have a clear definition of what life is within the mechanistic paradigm. So you can't ask the question because you can't define the concept you're asking about. Free will, that's also the main problem with it, is it's really hard to define what you mean by freedom in a mechanistic paradigm. All subjective experience, right? None of these things kind of make sense. So can we have kind of another scientific perspective where the atoms, the fundamental building blocks, are actually goals and contexts, so that some of these, free will, for example, question, which is a question about goal-directedness and the freedom to be goal-directed, perhaps become very simple questions, and then the questions of, okay, how do atoms come together to form a molecule become the more complex questions. And the core point is that both these perspectives, the physics and the Telics perspective, should be complete within themselves in principle, right? That you don't have to have the other one to have a full description of reality. It's more useful for certain questions to have the other one. So let's compare kind of side by side what we mean by these. So in physics, an isolated point particle in an infinite vacuum has no properties, right? Yeah. In Telics, you'd have kind of the opposite, right? You would have an indivisible system. If you have a whole that does not have any divisions in it, then that can have no goals, right? In order for me to have a purpose or a meaning, that meaning has to be in relation to something else outside of myself, right? If I am the only thing that exists in the universe and there's nothing else, then there is no sense in which I can have a goal or a meaning. It's always relational, right? So maybe this makes a little more sense if I add this second part, where, right, to have motion in physics, that comes from context, right? In order to have a particle moving, you need to have it moving relative to something else. You need to have at least one other particle. So that's relativity and all of that. In Telics, similarly, goals arise from division. You have to have a dichotomy between the self and the other, or system and environment. System and environment is the usual dichotomy that gives kind of, the goal of survival for an animal, right? That idea that an animal survives comes from that, okay, there is a me and there is a not me, right? If I don't have that division, then there is no concept of survival, because, I just turn into a decaying little thing, but, it's from the environment, from the whole perspective, it's all fine, right? Because it's all atoms moving around. So, yeah, so goals arise from division. In physics, we have forward causality. The past causes the present, right? Because we have causes and effects. Here we have kind of the simplest thing in Telics is inverse causality, where the rabbit is going towards the carrot because in the future it is hoping to get the carrot. So a goal-based explanation has this kind of inverse causal property, where the future state is the explanation for the present. In physics, atoms, these fundamental point particles, are fundamental. In Telics, boundaries are fundamental. So reductionism versus contextuality. So it's the because divisions are what cause. Okay, yeah, I think I'll just confuse it if I say more. Yeah, because boundaries create divisions between self and other. For example, right, the boundary of my skin tells me who I am versus what the environment is. So in physics, we have the concept of emergence, where many particles come together and start acting together to give rise to some new collective macroscopic behavior, right? So if I think of myself as made of atoms, then that's my free will or my consciousness are emergent properties of many microscopic particles. In Telics, we can imagine an opposite, right, emergence type of thing, where the properties of something are derived from how it is divided out of context, out of the whole, right? So you can have, for example, as I had in the last picture, in the last slide, a picture of chess, right? So for example, the explanation of why I move a pawn forward, right, could be kind of very local in the specific part of the game, but in the big picture, it comes from, my desire to win the game. But, that somehow is not enough to explain why I'm moving the pawn forward, right? Because, the local contexts become a lot more complicated, and there's kind of emergent properties of the local context that just from saying, okay, I'm trying to win the game, will not make sense why I'm moving this pawn forward, right? You need a lot more emergent properties. So just to ground in a few kind of examples, you could say that the polar bear is white because of the central dogma of biology. So DNA of the polar bear causes RNA, causes proteins, which then create a pigment that makes the polar bear white, right? And that would be a physics explanation of why the polar bear is white. A telic explanation would be based on Darwinism or adaptation. The polar bear is white so that it can blend into its surrounding and be a more effective hunter, right? That does not depend on the microscopics of what the polar bear is made of, right? And so this is also to illustrate that this telic perspective is already very common in some of our science, but here I think the exciting thing is to really clearly separate this division between physics and telics can help us a lot, because things like Darwinism and adaptation have always had a bit of a strange role in science. That on one hand, it's very clear that Darwinism is a powerful explanatory framework. And at the same time, somehow it doesn't fit the criteria for excellence that we're used to from physics, in the sense that it's very hard to make any predictions or to control anything with Darwinism, because there are so many possibilities of how adaptations could happen. So another example in chemistry, from physics perspective, you'd say that elements differ by their electron structure, whereas from telic perspective, you'd say that elements differ by their chemical interactions. And of course, the original way how Mendeleev came up with the periodic table was using chemical interactions, so using this telic perspective, right? And only afterwards we realized that that was kind of affirmed by the microscopic electron structures. And finally, maybe the simplest example is that light bending, in physics, light bending according to Snell's law, you would say is a physics explanation, and light tries to take the shortest path would be the telic explanation. And those, of course, are equivalent, but they're explanations from kind of different perspectives. And this is light bending at an interface, like refraction. Yeah. Okay, I'm realizing I'm taking a lot more time than I anticipated, but yeah, that was also quite a lot. So let's take a little moment before we get into our two examples. And inhale and exhale. Yeah. Let the brain integrate the mind. Okay, so this was a project I did some years ago during my PhD. It was in collaboration with several labs that built these robots that they called Smarticles. And the idea was to explore some swarm robotic behavior based on very helpless, simple robots. So each individual robot is just this thing with these arms. And if it sits there, it can't move because the arms are above the table. But if you put a bunch of them together, then they can push off of each other, which gives them some complex possible dynamics. Now, if they move their arms in random ways, then their behavior is basically just random, right? So these are the red and the white, it's the left and the right arm of each of the three robots. And this is their motion over time. So it's random. On the other hand, something we noticed was that if their arms moved in a more structured way, then that led to very organized periodic behavior that we kind of call these little dances. And it can switch from one little dance to another. But all these dances are very choreographed and pretty and synchronized. So here's the second dance, and then it switches back to the first one, where you see two of them are kind of doing the same thing in parallel, and the third one is opposite. So basically, we found that Smarticles spontaneously find coordinated collective behaviors when we drive them. Drive meaning driving their arms, moving their arms. Drive them in a structured way, right? And the way we can explain that, so we developed the whole theoretical framework, Rattling theory, which I'll get into a little bit later. For now, I'll just kind of give hand-waving explanations, is that they have kind of an emergent goal to be stable in a given environment. And the environment here is determined by how their arms move, right? By that external driving, because what the arms are doing, we're controlling externally through controlling their motors. And then the internal degrees of freedom is the specific orientation of the robots relative to each other. So something that, we stared at this for a while, and in some sense, this seemed very obvious, that it's like, okay, if you're driving them in a structured way, they go into a structured attractor. It seems almost trivial, right? A lot of dynamical systems go into attractors. So should we be surprised by this or not? And it took us a while to really tease that apart and understand what exactly to be surprised by. But the simplest way that I can explain that is that it's not true that, just because we drive them in a structured way does not mean that they will always go into a structured behavior. So for example, if we put them on top of beads so that they're skating around and have very little friction, and then we drive them in the same structured periodic way, then they don't go into any sort of regular pattern. They keep doing random stuff. So that means that just because we drive them in a structured way does not guarantee these choreographed dances. The other interesting thing was that we found that as a robotic swarm, usually you want a robot swarm to do something useful collectively together, Each individual one is too simple to do anything useful. But collectively, we found that, okay, yes, in one of these dances, they can rotate the ring clockwise. Then they can go into a different dance where they rotate the ring counterclockwise, So for example, there was this collective emergent behavior. And in another one, they can locomote. So they can kind of drive the ring together. And all three of these arise from the exact same arm driving pattern, which is this one, So the way we're driving them externally is the same in all three cases, but depending on the specific dance that they choreograph into, they can have these different properties. And then we tried to kind of string these together to have this collective robot sort of drive from point A to point B, then rotate a thing to open a little door so that it would actually do some fun little task. Okay, so this is an observation. How does it relate to anything that we've been talking about? Well, if you try to get, if I, for example, want to say that, okay, I want to get this little swarm into this triangle shape, And then I try to think, okay, how exactly should I move each arm so that it gets into this triangle shape? That turns out to be an extremely hard problem, because the exact way that these interact, there's a lot of uncertainty. These are hard surfaces pushing on each other. And one of the labs we worked with actually tried to solve that problem using AI, using traditional control theory tools, using a bunch of methods, and it was basically impossible, right? But here, instead, by leveraging this emergent goal that we found, right, which is to be stable in a given environment, we found that we can actually control this thing to do what we want just by using this principle that like survival of the stablest, right? So this is how we connect to non-biological adaptation, that these are very simple non-biological entities, but they already exhibit some adaptation properties, right? So we can control the swarm, not by understanding all the forces and how we should move the arms, but by understanding what the emergent goal of the collective is. And the emergent goal is to be stable. And so if we create an environment in which the only way to be stable is to be a certain thing, then we can control it. So for example, if we have this kind of more complicated drive, again, blue and red are the left and right arm of the three robots, then the different configurations that end up being stable, so this is some way to show the different configurations. So each point in the space is one configuration like this. So these end up being the configurations that are stable, right? Sort of this distribution, probability distribution. If I have a different drive, then I get different configurations that are stable, right? But now what we can do is we can create a drive where it switches from drive A to drive B in sort of a random sequence. And the only way to be stable under this drive A plus B is to be stable under both of them. So the prediction from this theory, right, is that the configurations that get selected by this A plus B drive are going to be the ones like the intersection of the other two, right? And so we saw that, and based on the theory that I'll talk about a little later, this wasn't just a qualitative prediction, this is actually a quantitative prediction that gives specific probability distribution. Okay, so we can select configurations by just designing the drive and without needing to think about what are all the forces inside the swarm, how it moves, right? So we can know what the swarm will do without needing to know how. And that's starting to look a little bit more telic, right? That we don't need to know the mechanism, we don't need to know the microscopics, we just need to know the collective contextual behavior. So just to connect it more concretely to Telics, Matthew came up with, before any of this, with this like litmus test for what a Telic explanation of something is, right? So how do we know, right? Just because we're so used to giving different theories, so how do we know that an explanation is physics or Telics? And he basically said that, okay, test one is that any explanation of X that requires knowing what is inside X or how it's implemented should be rejected in the sense that that's not a Telic explanation, right? So if we need to look inside X, and here, right, X is in a context of Y, and reject any explanation that remains meaningful when X is taken out of context, because Telics fundamentally relies on context. So it shouldn't work if we don't have a context that remains valid. And reject any explanation of X from Y that requires a full compositional account of X, because then we're kind of cheating, because by knowing full compositional account of Y, we'll also know what is inside X, kind of by extension. Okay, so for this previous slide, right, we had an explanation of what the swarm will do based on how we drive it, right? So this does not require us to know what exactly happens inside the swarm, right? Because we know that it will be in one of these organized dances for a given drive, and we don't know how that dance will be organized. It doesn't work when it's taken out of context, in the sense that the driving pattern, the motion of the arms, is fundamentally what determines what the swarm does. And we don't need a full compositional account of Y, in the sense of, again, right, like we don't need to know in detail how the swarm, the collective, like the ring, all the robots, and the drive, we don't need to know all of that. We just need to know basically the context, the way it's driven. So just to illustrate, so I know this is probably a little confusing, and it did take us a long time of staring at these robots to really understand how to think about them. But another bit that for me kind of helped to see that, okay, this really looks like adaptation and is kind of contextual and goal-driven, is that if I have a random drive, right, if arms are just moving randomly, that is 0 bits of predictive information, in the sense that the past does not predict the future, and the probability distribution over configurations is kind of smeared out. If I now have a little bit of predictive information, where the arms are doing random things, but all 3 robots are doing the same thing, so kind of like this, now that's 4 bits of predictive information. Knowing everything about the past allows you to predict a little bit about the future, just namely the fact that they will all do the same thing. And then gives a little more structure, a little less entropy to the resulting distribution. Even more predictive information, right, the structured drive, which we can calculate as 12 bits of predictive information, gives even more fine-tuned structure. And the fourth one, right here, the drive is structured, but is kind of more complex. It has 18 bits of predictive information, and now the symmetry between the 3 robots is broken, so you have kind of very specific points getting selected. So if I start from all possible initial configurations, this sort of gray blob, and start driving it over time, you see that the entropy of the distribution drops relative to how much predictive information there is in the drive, right? So the more information there is, the more the entropy drops. So it's almost like you have this learning behavior where the probability distribution really learns based on the information there is in the driving forces, in the environment, right? And this, again, this result, once we have this is now a hypothesis that is independent of the microscopic structure of what the composition of the swarm is. So for a very different swarm made out of very different robots, you might still expect this sort of behavior. The other interesting thing that's not shown here is that if we keep increasing the predictive information up to, say, 24 bits, then it actually goes back to this red thing, because the storage capacity of this system is kind of limited, right? That like it can store this much information and remember it and learn it, but if you give it too complicated of a drive, then it starts to look basically random. This is what I was saying a little earlier, that a super intelligence might look like it's doing random things from a limited cognitive perspective. And so because these systems are very simple, they have a limited cognitive ability. And so if the environment is too complex, it will not be able to predict it, and it will not be able to learn from it. So yeah, self-organization is only possible when the drive is predictable, and we see that kind of drive information imprints on the system over time, or that the system adapts to information in its environment. Okay, so this was our little toy example. That seems to basically, right, it's constructed very mechanistically. We know what it is, we know what it's made of, we're controlling everything. But the emergent behavior seems to be very kind of telic, that it's determined by goals and it's independent of the internal structure. Okay, how are we doing? I see that time is a lot. Let's take a little breather. See, maybe you're waiting for me to tie together everything into it.
No, absolutely not. It's just that you're putting. I've just not thought about a lot of the.
Yeah, that's the thing. No, it's just, I guess I wish I had more of a way to bring it all together into a clear conclusion at the end, which I don't. Just
no.
A lot of these ideas, and like I said, this is all, especially the Telics perspective, is quite new. So we're really like thinking about where to take this, how to prove, how to really illustrate it. So yeah, so sorry if this ends up kind of unsatisfying in this perspective, but this is why this is a call for collaboration. Okay, so Rattling theory is a theoretical framework that we developed based on this experiment with robots, but then has since been applied to a bunch of other examples. And it could perhaps be a bridge between physics and Telics. The theory itself is quite simple, although we've had a really hard time explaining it to people. And now that I see this dichotomy between physics and Telics, I think that I understand why it's so hard for people to swallow and to understand what this theory is about, is because it's very like Telics kind of in nature, and people are very used to thinking about mechanistic theories. And it doesn't fit into this mechanistic paradigm nicely. So people get very confused. So it's a theory of non-equilibrium self-organization, which is kind of a big claim already. And there are caveats for why we can make this big claim, because, it's a theory of two parts. First, we have a non-equilibrium Boltzmann distribution, where the steady state, the non-equilibrium steady state of a dynamical system is given by this expression that is kind of like Boltzmann distribution, except instead of energy, we have rattling. And I'll explain what that is in a second, actually right now. So rattling, if you have a Markov chain, which is basically a system that's jumping between these states according to some rates, and it's jumping in a random order, then the rattling is just the log exit rate. And what this expression says is that the steady state probability of being in a particular state is inversely proportional to the exit rate. So the lower your exit rate of a given state, the higher your probability of being in that state at long times is. So you end up in places that you don't leave, right? And that seems really obvious and really intuitive. And that's kind of a good thing, right? The reason that people get confused is because it seems like, isn't that trivial, right? That, yeah, you end up in places that you don't leave. The lower your exit rate, the higher your steady state probability. And the point is that that's not actually generally true, because, you know, exit rates are only part of the story. You also have entrance rates, right? And here we're saying that for complex systems that are sufficiently disordered, random, and, you know, kind of real world complex systems that aren't just spherical cows in a vacuum or atoms in vacuum chambers, oftentimes it's the exit rates that will dominate. And just knowing the exit rates is already gives you a lot of predictive power. And so that's why we can kind of formulate this whole theory, is based on kind of just that principle. Yes, and the next point of that is that if you end up in a place that you don't leave, but you are this robot swarm with this external drive, or you are a polar bear in it, right? Then maybe if your environment is very complex, then not leaving a particular state is actually very difficult, right? So that's the survival of the stablest. That just by looking at how a particular thing is, how stable it is in a particular environment, you can already tell how likely that thing is to evolve over time. And that's very powerful, because now if you give your system some complicated environment with a lot of predictive information that it has to learn in order to be stable, right? Like for a polar bear to survive, it has to learn to hunt very well because there isn't very much food, and it has to learn to survive against the cold. And right, there's all these things, challenges, right? And yet this framework says that, like, you know, ignoring all of those details, if you are stable in a given environment, that makes you likely to be there at long times, to be found in those states at long times. And yes, right, like I said, this does not apply to systems that are simple, like atoms and vacuum chambers. There are counterexamples to this, so we need to formulate what are the assumptions that make this true. And this is still kind of work in progress. We're building a library of examples where this works, where it doesn't work, to really see how that applies. The nice thing with the mechanistic and agentic dichotomy is that it kind of has both of these perspectives, right? That the agentic formulation of this is that the system looks for a way to be robust to its environmental forces. And the mechanistic one is that system randomly walks around the different states it can be in until it finds a configuration with a low exit rate, right? And those are both perspectives that are both valid, but come from these two angles and therefore give different insights. And yeah, like I said, we've studied a bunch of examples with this, including the robots, including 3 robots, including 20 robots, including some diffusion processes. And we see that this rattling quantity over time always robustly goes down, regardless of what the system is, regardless of what it's made of, regardless of this microscopic thing, and regardless of how complex the environmental drive is, right? So this is similar to energy going down over time in equilibrium systems. But here, in order for rattling to go down over time, it needs to basically somehow be adapting to its environment. So that's where the abiotic adaptation comes from. And since this has grown, so this was a science paper back in 2021 explaining kind of all of this theory. And since then, there's been a number of follow-up papers and a bunch of more examples and some formal theorems from Jacob Calvert, who I'm now collaborating with on this, who is a mathematician, so he was able to really formalize some of these assumptions. Yeah, we tried to assemble all these results in kind of a more easy to understand way on this website, rattling.org, which is still a bit of a work in progress, but it's already very usable. So if you're interested, you can check it out. And it's like rattling because it's a theory of self-organization, so organization. And yeah, and from that, there's questions like research questions that are very open. Could it be a bridge between physics and Telics? Could be a theory for origins of life or for non-biological adaptation? And there's a list of open questions on the website that we really need to solve in order to answer any of these. See if it can actually work in those more complex contexts. So yeah, so that's kind of exciting and kind of related. And let's take another breath.
Guys, remember, if there's anyone has any questions, don't forget to put them on the Slido or on the YouTube channel, and we'll be throwing them at Pavel at the end of the presentation. So
yeah, we're getting mostly close to the end. Yeah, see, this is the danger of giving me the open-ended time slot.
Hey, we love open-endedness here, so.
Yeah, so this was so far the main part of the concrete things I had to say. I wanted to end with broadening this out a little bit to kind of bigger sets of questions of where this physics versus Telics can apply. And also, yeah. So nested agents, right? So ideally, to show that Telics works, we want an example where a Telic theory is obviously more powerful than physics. And we often think of emergence from a reductionist perspective, where things emerge as molecules are made of atoms, cells are made of molecules, organs are made of cells, organisms are made of organs. Then you have societies, ecosystems, all of that, right? So this sort of from left to right origins of life. Telics would suggest an explanatory framework that goes directly in the opposite way, right? So to explain an organism, you need to understand its role in the ecosystem. Polar bear in a white climate. To understand the organ, you need to understand its role in an organism. To understand the cell, you need to understand its role in an organ, right? So the Telic hierarchy of explanations would just reverse the arrows, right? Where the most complicated thing to explain in reductionism is ecosystems. The most complicated thing to explain in Telics would be atoms. And it should predict behavior of parts from contexts or wholes. Origins of life, everything we've been talking about so far is just this one transition, molecules to cells, right? But there's all these other questions, and maybe some of them are actually more powerful in terms of, as an example of Telics. So problem of cooperation is a fun example, I find. So why do self-interested individuals cooperate? Right? And the usual answer is, okay, you have selection pressure across levels. That you have group selection, individual selection, ecosystem selection, and right. But that question, that's an answer from a reductionist perspective, and even the question of why do individuals cooperate only makes sense from a reductionist perspective, because in Telics, the individual does not exist without the group, without the context, right? The individual is defined by the context. So the question in Telics might be a problem of individuation. Why do different parts of a system all of a sudden start to gain partial autonomy, right? Because it's not obvious that, you know, my liver should be somehow autonomous, acting on its own from me, but to a large extent it does. I don't control my liver. And something that I like, a nice example of this is, right, if I'm maximizing my own profits at the expense of the environment, that's usually considered this like selfish, you know, behavior that's not cooperative. But actually, from Telics' perspective, you would say that that is a cooperative behavior in the sense that it's not a tension between the self and the group. It's a tension between two collectively constructed mythologies or realities, right? Tension between two group contexts where money is valuable or environment is valuable. And so an individual chooses to say that, okay, money is valuable. That's a group think myth that I buy into, but the environment is valuable, group think I don't buy into. Versus, you know, someone else might go the other way, right? And we would think, oh, they're a great cooperator. But really, both of these people are great cooperators. It's just what is the mythology that they subscribe to, the group context. So in this perspective, tragedy of the commons becomes kind of an impossibility because there is no self versus group. Self is defined by the group. Similar to that is problem of coordination, which is, you know, how do individuals coordinate actions to be collectively constructive? And, you know, the usual answers are, okay, hierarchies, you have like unilateral control, or money, bilateral, but using one number language, blockchain solutions, right? So these are kind of different coordination mechanisms. But again, this is only surprising, and coordination is only a problem from a reductionist perspective. In Telics, you'd say that coordination is a byproduct of how you define individuals, aka how you take your whole system and you chop it up into little pieces to say that, okay, that's an individual now, right? So for example, if you think of individual humans in society as individuals, then the usual problem of cooperation comes up. If you think of society as memes, right, mimetics from Richard Dawkins, and that basically ideas are the individuals and they live and parasitize on our brains and, you know, just multiply and reproduce using our thoughts, right? Then the problem of coordination across ideas will look very different than the problem of coordination among people, right? So it really, what you coordinate is what determines the problem of coordination. And from a whole system perspective, like there is no true individual way, you know, the correct way to chop it up into pieces, right? Every way to chop up a system into pieces, aka to, you know, take a society and say, okay, what are the useful individual units? It's all going to be a choice. So the need for coordination only arises when you're trying to build a new group or a new system out of the individuals that you identified as individuals from an old or existing system. So it's a bit of a interesting kind of strange paradigm. Telics would imply that instead of mechanism design, which is this problem of coordination is usually thought of as mechanism design, it would instead think of group evolution, how you take one group and you change it into another group, or one ecosystem and you transform it into another ecosystem. And one thing that I know CrossLabs kind of works on to give this context, and this is a project I also worked on at General Motors for a few years, is how to coordinate a system of AIs, right? So because system performance is actor performance, individual actor performance, plus actor coordination. So if you have a bunch of people and robots in a company, then the way they all interact with each other and the way they coordinate will determine how well the whole company works, right? So as AI becomes widespread in our society, then system-wide coordination, which is currently done just by people being like, okay, yes, ChatGPT is good, therefore I will use it, and here's the performance metric. So it's done by people who choose to use ChatGPT or not, right? But that becomes impossible once we have many, many AIs or many more AI systems than people. And so we need the choice of which AIs we use and how we coordinate among them to become more automated and more principle driven rather than kind of individual human preference driven. Otherwise, you have this AI alignment problem where you can have unanticipated group system-wide behaviors that you will never tell by looking at individual performance, or you get a lot of redundancy where you build a lot of models that just do the same thing in different silos. And this allows to leverage all of the different coordination problems. And we had a specific project where we leveraged kind of free market economics to coordinate between individuals and AIs. Anyway, so this is also a few problem spaces that I think this physics versus Telics perspective can give new insights on. And this is my last conclusion slide, just again showing the journey that we went on together. And these are the different websites that I'm currently working on. One is my personal site and blog. You can follow some of my writing there. The second is this Rattling research community hub that we just built. And the third is mindful research principles and retreats. So together with Matthew, who has developed this Telics perspective, we're hosting mindful research retreats in France to figure out how to turn our research process into a meditation practice. I don't know how meditative this presentation was, but that's the idea. So thanks.
No, thank you. That was thought-provoking beyond what I imagined. It was really, really fascinating. I think I'm a biologist personally, and I always just accept Darwinism and adaptation as just as a product of what the physics side of it is, but to kind of separate them as like two principles is sort of really interesting to me as well. And the thought of emergence as well. Like I can tell you about, at least personally speaking, I can tell you what a ecosystem is and the different facets within an ecosystem, and you sort of just take the micro as a given. But to look at it through this sort of emergence rather than emergence process is really, really fascinating and something I've never thought about. So thank you so much for opening my eyes a little bit. Yeah,
that's why I got excited about this when Matthew shared some of these ideas. I was like, everything makes sense now.
Anyway, I will pass over to the Slido. Guys, again, if there's any questions, please stick them in the Slido. And we've got one from Cheshire here. He says, or they say, how do the agentic and mechanistic model types relate to black and white model types? Are agentic models always black and white models?
I don't know what black and white models are.
Black and white. Black models are sort of where you don't, I assume it's where you don't see inside the system itself, and it's just more you just sort of see the results of the system, whereas white models, I believe you can kind of peer into and you can see the processes that govern them and what they look like inside.
Okay, like black box versus white box?
Oh, yes, exactly. Oh, yeah, sorry, that's.
Okay, I guess that's. And so what was the question again?
How do the agentic and mechanistic model types relate to black box and white box model types?
Okay.
Are agentic model types always black box models?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't thought about that before, but Yeah, that seems like in a way that's definitely a relevant connection. I don't know if it'll be exactly like that, but that does sound plausible. That it would be the agentic ones would be kind of going more black box versus this being white box. But there is a usually when you say black box or white box, you kind of have this like, okay, white box is better because we know more
Mm.
about it. Whereas here, I kind of want to invite this perspective that um, it's not that you know more about the white box, it's that you focus on what the white box is made out of. Whereas for the black box or for the agentic models, you focus what it's immersed into, immersed or what it evolved in, what environment, what context it evolved in. Um, I do think it maps well to like, hard-coded algorithm being, it's a white box, and that's more the mechanistic models, and machine learning or neural networks are going to be more agentic, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that we understand the white box more than we understand the black box, because it's understandings from different directions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think we can understand, right? I don't know, like, yeah. I think that's a good question to think about.
Yeah, I think it's almost looking from like bottom up and
Yeah,
top
bottom
down
up
in
or
a
top.
way.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a really interesting
because
way of
right, like
thinking about it.
any biological system, any cell, any right will always be a black box in this definition that you don't fully know what it's made out of, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't understand it very well. I don't know, if you have a cat and you've known it its entire life and you know all of its behaviors and desires and likes and dislikes, you understand it pretty well, even though it's a black box.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice way of looking at it. Thank you, Cheshire. That's a great question. There's an anonymous saying, is in Rattling, is there a system environment distinction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I feel like
No.
I should say more than just yes. I don't know. But yeah, that's one of the things that Rattling model kind of assumes, is that you have this distinction of what is your system and what is your environment. There is the more kind of first version of Rattling with just Markov chains, where maybe it's not so obvious, but even there, you still have the transition rates among your states in the Markov chain that are kind of given by an environment you can imagine. But they're kind of problem setup, part of problem setup. So yeah.
Okay. So is kind of the definition that the system has to exist within the environment itself, and they are mutually exclusive from one another, or
You have to have
way.
like, it's kind of an arbitrary divide of what is the system and what is the environment. But in order to do like the Rattling theory, in order for that to make sense, you kind of need to make that distinction first. Which, right, in some sense, if you guys know of Friston's free energy and all that, right, his whole thing is like the Markov blanket needs to divide the system from the environment as a first thing. And yeah, we never explicitly connected it to Friston stuff, but it definitely seems somehow related, and like two different aspects of potentially related problem space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, interesting. I'll pass on another one. Martin asked, emergence is when I cannot derive the behavior. Oh, I'll just pull this one up. Emergence is when I cannot derive the behavior of the parts from the behavior of the whole. I can't determine an atom's dynamics from human goals. Is that correct?
So emergence with an E is when you get emergent behavior of a system from the parts.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, you're saying you cannot, in the sense that the collective coarse grained behavior is not fully determined by the parts. That's emergence.
Mm-hmm.
And so emergence would be the equivalent in the opposite direction, that you cannot determine the atom's dynamics from human goals. Yeah, I would agree with that, in the sense that you have substrate independence, right? That you can implement some computation on this computer or that computer, or maybe some other computational substrate. And so just by looking at the computer and looking at the computation it's doing, you don't know if it's implemented in silicon or in carbon chemistry or in some other thing.
Yeah, I can understand that. And finally, just a final question from Cheshire. What would be an example of the tragedy of the commons not happening when you apply a telic perspective, but maybe it's happening in the mechanistic interpretation?
Yeah, so tragedy of the commons usually would be that, well, I mean, tragedy of the commons is kind of a very specific thing in a game theory context, right? So it requires a very clearly defined set of rules, a clearly defined game, so that you can then have this behavior where, you're in a state where if everybody cooperated, they would be better off then, but it is disincentivized for any individual to change their strategy when they're all not cooperating. And the thing is that, right, Telics would question, it would sort of question that structure, right? That basically Telics would say that there is no possible selfish interest, right? Like, it's not possible to be self-interested, especially at the expense of a group, because the group is primary and the self is emergent, right? So any self-interest that I might have is actually derived from the group context, right? So if I want a lot of money, that's derived from the fact that the group taught me to value money, right? In a more kind of primal thing, if I want to survive, right? So I'm in an environment and I want to hoard resources or food in order to survive, that's still, right? If you look from a perspective of an ecosystem, there is an ecosystem. There is no individual selves. This is where it connects to mindfulness and Buddhism, right? The individual selves are a particular way of chopping your ecosystem up into bits, right? Like, the tree is not an inherent existing entity. It's just a story we tell ourselves. And if you look at how trees communicate with each other, how they are all like sharing nutrients through mycelium network, and all, you might say that, okay, actually the tree should not be the individual. Maybe it's the carbon that should be the individual that's using the trees to change its form, or I don't know, right? Some other like very different perspective. And so from that perspective, the ecosystem is real, and the individual and the individual's desire to survive is coming from, it's like derived from the ecosystem that it's a part of. So like, why would an individual want to survive? Well, it's because that's what the ecosystem is optimized to do, right? If individuals survive, and individuals don't always want to survive, right? In certain species, I mean, for a single cell, right, you could say that by splitting into two, the original dies in order to give birth to its offspring, right? Or for spiders that get eaten after mating, right, in order to provide more nutrients to, or a bunch of animals that self-sacrifice for offspring, right? Like, the individual survival is not always the goal, right? And so if I am a lion and I'm hoarding resources for individual survival, that's not a selfish thing. That's just because that's my role in this particular ecosystem and how it evolved.
Yeah, I suppose thinking from like a mechanistic standpoint, it's the desire to pass on the mechanics is what is the driver of the behavior. At least.
You mean
the desire to pass on their DNA and their genes is what drives the behavior.
Ooh. From the mechanistic side. Well,
yes.
If you're saying the word desire, you're already on the Telic side a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
You're already using goals.
Okay, yeah, right? I can see that now. Yeah.
Right, and like, where did that goal come from? Well, that goal is an emergent. I think that's very much a Telic side of what you're saying, right? Yeah. That came from the way evolution structured reality, or biosphere and all that, right?
Yeah, it's almost the drive to pass on
Because
the genes, which is the goal, which is the Telic side again. Yeah, they're quite difficult.
Because
to
again,
separate
right,
in.
we have counter examples of organisms that don't particularly try to pass on their genes. Because what is it? Michael Levin's, the worms that he studies, that are apparently like, they have a bunch of different DNAs inside a single worm. and they split by like cells. They just like peel off of each other to reproduce, and then they merge. And yeah, so
yeah, it's like I said, I've introduced some really fascinating theories that I personally had never thought about. So yeah, it's been a really fascinating journey to go on with you. That's it for the questions on the Slido. I think that will be it for the presentation, for the talk. I'd like to say thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really fascinating. And yeah, if anyone would like to follow the links that are on the slide available, please do. And apart from that, I think look forward to seeing you all next time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, and reach out with questions on collaboration. And
Absolutely,
talk
I
later.
encourage people to. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, bye.